Hey guys, unfortunately for you, I am back. My John Blanche curated army painter sets just came in, and we're gonna unbox them, paint up some tiny men with them, and decide if they're up to snuff. You're watching Apollo Geist. So for those uninitiated, John Blanche is a bit of a legend in the wargaming scene. He's a tenured artist who worked at Games Workshop for decades, and is the original visionary behind Warhammer 40k's aesthetics. If I had to compare Blanche to someone on the other side of the globe, he's to Warhammer what Yoshitaka Amano is to Final Fantasy. Both were on the ground floor when their respective games were created, and although those games' styles have evolved drastically, their influence can still be seen today. Amano and Blanche also both have a devoted following of fans who will ardently insist their visions of the games are the only ones that exist. For Blanche, it's not hard to see why. There's so much character in his work for the games in ways that aren't as observable in modern 40k's hyper-realistic illustrations. So influential Blanche's work is, there's an entire mini-painting style named after him, Blanchitsu. Army Painter recently released 2 sets with new paints in their range curated personally by Blanche. The fact these are mostly original colors and not merely just pre-existing colors he picked out of a lineup really appealed to me. I will say, the fact each paint set is nearly $10 more than the starter paint set despite having 1 bottle less did make me raise an eyebrow, but it's the Dr. Dre effect. These are unique paints and you're paying a little extra to have a famous guy's name on it. It is what it is. Putting both volumes on the table, we get a box with a free brush sealed in shrink wrap against it on the outside. I don't know if this is like a pre-order bonus or something, but this feels a little inelegant, especially when you need to stack these and the brushes risk crushing the box. But it's fine. If you're buying paint sets to display them mint sealed, you're a fucking psychopath. Opening it up, we're treated to a little paint guide / product line pamphlet, a second pamphlet explaining the paints and where they fit into the rest of the range, and a nice little illustration / letter from Blanche itself. The illustrations are the same between volumes, in case anyone is wondering. I'm not really like a landscape kind of guy, but hey, neat. Volume 1 features Blighted Green, Moonbeam Yellow, Ironclad Gray, Ivory White, The Darkness, Banshee Brown, the Speed Paint Blood Moon Red, the washes Warm Skin Shade and Grimdark Shadow, and the metallic paint Emperor's Gold. Volume 2, whose non-paint contents are identical, includes Blanched Berry, Tainted Garden, Midnight Olive, Sunburst Ochre, Fiery Vermilion, Ruddy Terra, the Speed Paint Turnbold Turquoise, the Wash Voodoo Shade, the Effect Paint Grim Rust, and the metallic paint Heavy Metal. To those uninitiated, many of the paints featured belong to a color palette known as the Zorn palette, named after the artist Anders Zorn. In short, this palette uses lots of reds, grays, browns, and yellows. Despite the bias towards warmth, the Zorn palette is surprisingly versatile and can be used for plenty of different subject matter. For those who are fans of Blanche's work, another artist who uses this palette to great effect is Ashley Wood of 3A and Underverse fame. Anyways, we're going to be painting up some minis using exclusively these paints, but truth be told, these sets sort of snuck up on me and arrived when I didn't expect them, so as of filming the unboxing, I hadn't quite decided what I'd be using.
Hi, non-editing Apollo Geist here, so I just wanted to talk about these 2 miniatures that I'm painting real quick. These are just some, basically, miniatures I'm not really going to be using for anything, so I thought they'd be some good test dummies to print on. So this is a Plague Marine. This is actually a conversion from an old 2000s Space Marine, the really short ones. I had to cut this dude's legs straight in half and add some layers of claw plate before gluing it back on. And this did give him a suitable amount of height, and he's no longer a manlet, but also he has this really comically splayed out pose that's actually almost too big for the base itself. And really, I'm just not a huge fan of how this guy looks, and he's probably not gonna be part of my main squad, but I think he'd be a nice test piece. For this guy, I'm probably gonna go ahead and do a conventional sort of Blanche Zorn palette color scheme, sort of a demonstration of the typical stuff you see. Now this guy, this is the anti-tank hunter from Trench Crusade. So this is actually an FDM print. I just got the Bamboo A1 Mini. I printed this. This is the first miniature I printed off of it, and I used the de facto 0.4mm nozzle. This actually turned out really good for a 0.4mm nozzle. I did have to do a bit of sanding and filling to make it look good, but this is perfectly viable as far as prints go. I have another one that I have on hand that I've been working on. Actually, this is my version of it that I'm doing, and I like this one a little bit more. So I'm gonna go with this as far as an actual unit for my team. But yep, so this one I'm probably gonna go ahead and do a bit more of like probably more of a cold color scheme, I'm thinking. I may not be trying to do a full-on Blanchitsu. I may just be painting this however I want to paint it as a way of demonstrating what you can do with the paints, but we'll see. Future editing Apollo guys may have different plans, but let's go.
So I find Blanchitsu as a mini painting style really interesting because it sort of highlights the different things about Blanche's art that people fixate on. For some people, the palette used doesn't matter, they just paint the models in a really dreary tone. For others, it's not even really how you paint it, but the eccentric kitbashing choices you do that fit the spirit of Blanche's illustrations. Some might tell you Blanchitsu and Blanche's style are not the same thing. There is no single arbiter of what Blanchitsu is, not even John himself, and art is purely subjective, so none of these interpretations are wrong. But me personally, when I think of Blanche's art, I see white paper, stained and scrawled over with blacks, reds, and the occasional green. Despite the subject matter of Blanche's art, the color white is still there, it's just trapped, suffocated, stifled. To that end, I wanted the Plague Marine to start out with a really pale base tone, but I also admittedly have sort of been underusing my airbrush lately, so I decided I'd use it to create some interesting undertones first. I first start with Sunburst Ochre. Like most of the AP paints I've used so far, these flow pretty nice out of the airbrush. There is some spattering you might see due to my poor thinning, but we'll pretend that's on purpose. Then I use the Blood Moon Red Speed Paint to add some feathered red areas. I was completely making this up as I went along, just picking colors I thought would look cool. To offset the warmth, I added some puffs of Blighted Green, sort of placing them where I think shadows would be. This dude was starting to look like a moldy orange, so after that I used Ivory White, spraying mostly from above to tamp down all the other colors. My camera did not like this, so it looks super washed out. Once that was all done, I put down my airbrush and picked up Emperor's Gold. There's another metallic paint from the range called Death Metal that's maybe my new favorite metallic, and I was very tempted to just use that instead. It's this really good dark platinum that I think is perfect for Blanche-inspired stuff, but I held strong and stuck with this one. Emperor's Gold is pretty good though, sort of a pinkish, almost rose gold tone that complements the other warm colors well. I picked out the armor trim, thrusters, another miscellany, and that's all I'm doing for the base coats. I go over the entire model with Voodoo Shade, and I like this one a lot. It's a sepia-toned wash, but also skews very gently green. I haven't tried out any of the new washes until now, but I was impressed at how little surface tension these had. Pretty good. From there, I just used several other paints from the set as glazes to continue staining the surface. I used Blanched Berry to add some shadows, went back to Ivory White to edge highlight, and then used Moonbeam Yellow afterwards as a sort of median shadow. I also edge highlighted the metals by mixing Ivory White into Emperor's Gold, but I think I could have skipped this step. With that, I painted the base, which I didn't bother filming, and then moved on to the Communicant. Like before, I first base coated this with a variety of colors out of the airbrush, starting first with the darkness. I added Banshee Brown to the areas where I thought blood would be more visible in the flesh, followed by Tainted Garden, which was pointless and ended up covering up all those nice color variations I'd set up. Like I said, making it up as I went. I used the metallic paint Heavy Metal to hit the armor and weapons. I definitely like this one a lot less, kind of a boring gunmetal gray that, again, pales in comparison to Death Metal. I painted the back of the legs with Ironclad Gray, and then used more Emperor's Gold to hit the tips of the bullets. After that, I used Grimdark Shadow on the armor, another one that I wasn't all that impressed by. I think this is supposed to be more of a dark gray than pure black, but over an already dark model, I couldn't tell the difference. Like Voodoo, it flowed well, so not a bad wash, it just really struggles to stand out here. I used a glaze of Tainted Garden to highlight the musculature, adding increasing amounts of Ivory White. This was tricky, as I didn't want there to be too much contrast and wash out the dingy tone I was going for. I used Turnbull Turquoise to bring back a colder tone, applying it as a shadow to the musculature before just applying it all over as a glaze when I realized I didn't like how green he looked. I did another round of highlights afterwards and was much happier. I remembered that warmth I initially applied with the airbrush before I foolishly covered it up and applied a glaze of Blanched Berry to those areas again. This to me is when I finally entered we're cooking territory. I edge highlighted the metal bits by adding Ivory White to Death Metal, which resulted in just a pretty plain silver. I tried to add a gradient to the waist armor and some little scratches. I wanted to add some red to contrast against this otherwise damp-looking dipshit. I painted on a cross with blanched berry and applied it to the helmet visor too, before adding fiery vermilion. A big criticism of the Fnatic range on release was the dearth of warm orange tinted reds, so I just know some people were like hooting and hollering over this one. I added some scratches with heavy metal to create the illusion paint chipping, which reminded me to add some crust to this dude's loadout. I used Grim Rust, and to be frank, this is probably the weakest paint in the set for me. It's the same paint with microscopic beads strat they did with the other effect paints, and I'm just not all that impressed by how they look when they dry. I also tend to be very sparing with how I apply rust, so I applied the streaks in such thin applications that I didn't really see a buildup of that texture except on like the gun. It is a good color, this just doesn't really fall into my use case is all. To create a more varied rust color, I applied Banshee Brown with a sponge followed by more sponging with heavy metal. This really saved the gun, which I think printed the worst out of the rest of the model. I've been using the Bamboo A1 Mini for a few weeks and I really like it. This model, despite printing using the factory settings and factory nozzle, is perfectly game-worthy once painted up. Stay tuned for more of my thoughts on FDM printing in the month to come. Otherwise, I was done sans the base. I painted that off camera like before because fuck that, and let's see how these turned out.
End result.
These turned out pretty damn good. Despite spending $100 on these paints, I kind of went into this review with a fair bit of skepticism. Just because someone's name is on something doesn't mean it's going to be good. Collaborations, or at least the illusions of one, can often involve little of the advertised person, besides them signing a piece of paper and forgetting about it. But I'm pleased to report that, a few iffy paints aside, I'm pretty damn happy with my purchase. I'd say about half of these paints are about to enter my main rotation going forward. All of that said, does that mean you, the esteemed viewer, should buy these? Well, no, not necessarily. Let's be clear here, these paints are not cruise control to Blanchitsu. You still have to choose the colors out of the set and figure out how they interact with each other. These paints simply narrow down the process of selection when pursuing a specific end result. And because it does need to be said, you don't need these paints to do Blanchitsu. Don't believe me? Well, here's a Rubric Marine I painted last month using paints I already had in rotation. Depending on your definition of Blanchitsu, you may already have everything you need to do it, or failing that, you can buy individual paints for much cheaper. I will also note, there are several paints in this set I will probably never use. While I feel I got my money's worth, your mileage may vary when you find out that you have no use for a third of the paints included. So let's just put it this way, okay? So if you like John Blanche, if the novelty of a paint set with colors handpicked by him appeals to you, then yeah, it's probably worth it. They're good paints in my opinion. But make no mistake, the paint does not maketh the mini. That's you, baby. Anyway, who bought these paints? What do you think of them? Any other artists you'd like to see paint sets curated by? Do you think I should just fuck off and croak? Let me know in the comments. Peace.